I'm Ayelet Waldman.
I'm Paul Waldman.
This is Boundary Issues.
Welcome to Boundary Issues, the podcast where two siblings solve all the world's problems while blaming each other for their own. Today, we figured that we are like one more podcast episode away from solving the Israel-Palestine problem. So that is what we are going to do over the next 45 minutes or so.
But first, can we just please spend 2 minutes freaking the fuck out? Because I don't know. I mean, I'm trying not to be like a Democratic bedwetter, but you have been silent, Paul. None of your confident predictions, which, okay, fine, they're usually wrong. So I don't even know why I want you to make them. But like, if I have to get out of bed every morning and see yet another Trump ahead, the vibe is Trump, with you being like dead silent, I'm going to kill myself. So just say something hopeful. One fucking thing hopeful.
Okay, I stopped making confident predictions after 2016.
As well you should have, since you ruined my life and the life of everyone in the country. But go on.
Yes, it was clearly my fault. I made people too overconfident. But, look, as I've said a million times, it is a toss-up. Now, if you wanted me to, I could tell you like 10 reasons why you'd rather be Kamala Harris at this point than Donald Trump.
Give me one reason.
Okay, well, she's got more money. She has a more sophisticated ground operation. She has a more disciplined candidate.
Okay.
She has already erased Trump's advantage from everything we can tell on the economy. And abortion has been, over the last few years since Dobbs was handed down, has been the most powerful motivator of people getting to the polls. Trump is putting a lot of his energy into motivating young dude bros. Yes, I wrote a piece about this on my Substack. Go see it, paulwaldman.substack.com.
Yeah, actually, I'm going to be kind to my brother for a minute. You actually should subscribe to his Substack because it's actually really, really good. And I'm the last person who would admit that. So go subscribe.
And those are the least likely people to vote. Whereas the young women, among whom Harris is leading by a much larger margin than Trump is leading among young men, are more likely to vote and more highly motivated by the issue that's most important to them. So, all those things together, you could say, well, yeah, she's got an advantage. But at the same time, it's going to be really freaking close and nothing is certain. And it's basically a coin flip. So there we are.
So let's talk to our guest because we want to talk about something really hopeful where we can really see a future that leads into an amazing direction rather than the American political system. So we're going to talk about Palestine and Israel today. Hi, Mo.
Hi there.
So Mo was saying he was just asking him how he wanted me to introduce him. And I'm not going to introduce him how he said, because he's not a knucklehead. Mo is a brilliant Palestinian American filmmaker, and he does all sorts of other things in the creative fields. But most importantly, at least for me right now, I feel like Mo is my compass, my true north, a true thought leader in the area of Palestinian, Israeli. I don't even want to say the conflict because that just sort of, there's got to be, maybe that's my first question for you, Mo. What should we say if we don't want to say the Palestinian and Israeli conflict?
Wow. I guess I'd go. I guess I'd go with situation.
We're jumping in. Situation. Hellscape.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is a conflict, and I think that framing is fundamentally a huge part of the problem. We've set it up in ways that become zero sum because most conflicts are zero sum, and so right off the bat, from the moment you start talking about it, from the moment you start describing it, you're setting up the entire kind of thing as an equation where one side has to lose for the other side to win. If you're looking to me for hope, this may not be the best conversation we're going to have.
When you say that, when you talk about that zero-sum game, that really is kind of what I feel like it's that perspective that kind of launched you into this position that you are now, which is really, it is an exaggeration to say that you're a thought leader on this issue. So first, let's talk a little bit about your background. So you're Palestinian American. You're from, were you born? Tell us about your family. You have quite a remarkable family. You come from two lines that are very impressive, shall we say.
Yeah, sure. Let me start by saying something I've kind of gotten used to saying recently. I don't speak for anybody. I'm not here to speak for Palestinians or Israelis, or I think legally I'm allowed to speak for my 16-year-old for another 2 years. But apart from that, my views are mine, and often fairly idiosyncratic. Look, my background is my family on my father's side is a fairly well-known family in Jerusalem. My dad was born in Jerusalem. My grandfather was born in Jerusalem, on all the way back. My mother's family is a fairly prominent family out of Nablus, in Palestine. And well, my mother's family stayed for the most part. She grew up in the West Bank. My father's family left in 48 in
Mhm.
Jerusalem, and so they moved to Cairo, but my granddad went back and forth. So he continued to work in Jerusalem, and he actually died in Jerusalem because he wanted knafe, and his diabetes got the best of him.
Yeah, I was recently reading Raja Shahada's memoir again about his father, and it really brought home to me this feeling that he had, which is this sense that he was going away for a minute, for a few days, for a week or whatever it was. Is that the feeling that you think, your grandfather was still essentially commuting because these places are very close together? Was that the feeling your father had, eh, certainly in the early days and then throughout his life, that we walked out of the door of our house, surely we'll be able to open the door again and walk home?
I'm not sure that my father did. I do think that more of his relatives do. I think my father grew up in Egypt in his brain. Like, I think he felt a deep connection to Jerusalem, and would go back a fair amount. My uncles go back regularly still. But I think for my dad, there wasn't that sense of connection. My dad, I think, was very much a pessimist about the whole thing. I don't
Mhm.
think he ever foresaw anything like a resolution from his perspective. I think my mom was a little bit more optimistic, but not by much. I think part of that is, being West Bank as opposed to
Right.
48, if that makes sense.
So where did you grow up?
I was born in Cairo, but never lived there. I was born in Cairo because my grandmother was there. And at the time, my parents were living in Kuwait, and that's where I grew up. So I was in Kuwait till I was about 10 or so, and then went to boarding school in the UK while my family was in Jordan. So I'd go back home to Jordan, holidays and stuff like that. And then my last 2 years of high school were spent in Jordan. I got pulled out of boarding school and put into an American high school, which
Hence the
was,
impeccable accent.
I actually changed my accent when I was 18. When I moved to the US, when I realized that when you sound like this and you're brown, people think you're an absolute twat. Um, Come to find out later, when I'm older, that it's a useful accent because people think it's attractive. But
Yes, Americans think British accents are very sophisticated and charming.
yeah, maybe not when you're 18 and just desperately trying to fit in.
Mhm.
Um, I felt a massive cultural gap in my life when I moved to the US because I don't have the same cultural touchstones as Americans. So all of my jingles are either, Middle Eastern jingles or British jingles. The TV shows that I grew up with are either British shows or, funnily enough, Kuwait would buy these shows that had been canceled in the US. And so I have like really strong memories of shows that were American but only played for a season, but in Kuwait were like fairly popular. Like Holmes and Yo-Yo, which I'm sure
I
none
don't
of
never
you.
even heard of.
Yeah, there you go.
No.
So now, Mo, when you got to the States, did you have a Palestinian American community that you could slot into? Was there a world that you felt like you had access to? Because you came
Yes,
without your immediate family, right?
I came on my own. I was 17. I came to Boston for a year. I went to Northeastern, and then I transferred to Berkeley. When I first came, I did have a fairly strong social group. There was a lot of kids from my high school in Jordan that had come to the States. There weren't so many in Boston. There was a bunch of them in DC, a bunch of folks in Southern California. and kind of scattered around the Boston area, but most of the kids in Boston were older than me. There was some connection. There was a little bit of a community. I think initially I started to get involved at Northeastern with some Palestinian groups and pro-Arab groups. I'll be honest and say I think my introversion makes me a particularly bad ad for like clubs and political movements, because generally it's like, hey, does anyone need help making flyers? Because I'm not good with the being out on streets and talking to people.
Well, see, Mo, that makes no sense to me because you burst on the scene post October 7th with this incredible. It started as a thread on Threads, and then you put it up on Medium, and it went astonishingly viral. It was called 50 Completely True Things. I would love for you to tell us a little bit about it, how it came to be, what inspired you to write it. Did you wake up one night in the middle of the night and just pour this out of your heart?
Look, I think you have to go back a little bit. I came to the States in a lot of ways, with a lot of idealism. I still cringe when I think of some of the college essays that I wrote, talking about, how I wanted to be part of a just and sustainable peace in the region. And my goal was to come here and to be in like foreign service or to work in human rights law or something like that. I think my engagement in the States with a lot of the discourse, and I think having a little bit of distance from either Palestinians or Israelis, really made me pessimistic. I got super cynical and I stopped talking, especially after Rabin died. I really stopped talking about the issue, and it became almost pathological. Like I don't discuss it with people. I would turn off the news if it came on and they were talking about Israel. Like it felt very in my chest, felt bad to even think about, in the sense that there's a deeply terrible reality at the heart of this, which is thousands of people have died even though we all actually know the solution. It is deeply frustrating to think about that, to think about the many, many people whose lives have been ruined, whose families have been destroyed, the path of whose lives have been shifted when everybody knows, broadly speaking, what the solution is, and yet we're led by people who do not have the will or the vision to just, excuse my language, get the fuck over it and get it done.
What is that solution, Mo, that is there that we won't do that we know?
I think there's a lot of magical thinking on both sides. I think there's a lot of Israelis who, like, their version of Santa Claus is that the Palestinians are going to wake up one day and go, like, you know what, you're right. Like it's cool. I'm moving to Jordan. We're cool. Just keep all the shit. And I think the same is true for Palestinians. Like, I think there's like a deep thread of magical thinking that thinks they'll do the same. They'll be like, okay, you know what? You're right. I'm going back to Morocco or I'm going back to Poland and we're cool. I think fundamentally the solution is you're going to have to share it. I can argue all day about the justice of that or the injustice of that and what that means or what that doesn't mean. And like there's all kinds of theoretical arguments or historical arguments that you can make about the Nekba and the Holocaust and the original Zionist dream and the Mizrahi people who've been coming, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in the end, like Elon Lee Green said it best, is like there are 7 million Arabs and there are 7 million Israelis and nobody's leaving. And I think that until people wrap their heads around that, we're not going to move forward, because the only solution is we've got to figure out a way to live together. As much as we hate each other, we've got to figure out a way to live together.
I hang on to that too. I feel like when the first time I heard Alon Lee and Sally Abed from Standing Together say that so simply, I realized that I had like been tying myself up in knots when I thought of, oh, what's the next step? What is the future that I want? What am I fighting for? And I thought, oh, that's just a really easy formulation. And it's so true. 7 million of us, whoever your us is, 7 million of them, whoever your them is, no one is fucking going anywhere. So what is the way forward? Do we just kill each other until we're all lying dead, or do we figure out a way to live side by side?
I've said it multiple times and I get shit for it until people get to the end. But like, I think there's 3 options. We kill every single fucking Israeli. or we kill every single fucking Palestinian, or we figure out how to live together. And I think, the corollary to those three choices is that I think unless you are a literal fucking psychopath, there's only one choice.
And yet,
And yet literal fucking psychopaths, are making those choices.
And, I've been asking this question for a while. I have a much better sense of what Israelis think and the nuances in Israeli opinion than I do of the nuances in Palestinian opinion. But I still have trouble wrapping my heads around what people from the center to the right in Israel really think the ultimate outcome is. Is it going to be that at some point, if enough force is deployed against them, Palestinians will just, as you said, give up and be like, you know what? Yeah, we're just going to go to Jordan. And I think that there are a lot of Israelis who they might not articulate it that way, but that's what they believe. Like, certainly on the extreme. Like, I just saw a report the other day about a group of West Bank settlers who went to have a protest right outside Gaza in order to promote the idea of new settlements back into Gaza. For those who don't know, there used to be settlements, but when it was handed over to Palestinians, they dismantled them. But it was a relatively small number of people, of Israelis who were there in Gaza. And Ariel Sharon, who was the prime minister at the time, basically said, like, get out or we're going to move you. And the army came in and removed them. But now you have people on the far right, including Likud members of the Knesset, politicians who are there saying, and one woman who is a member of the Knesset said literally that what we need is another Nakba. That's the solution. We're just going to move them out. And
I don't even think that's such a far right idea, Paul. I wrote a piece in New York Magazine that was really sort of focused on what does the left think and feel right now. And I think that in the heart of many of the left, that is the hope that they will we don't want to kill anybody, but man, they'll just go to Cairo, go to
it'll be a gentle
Damascus,
Nakba.
a gentle Nakba, not a Nakba, just a gentle shifting of
It's the
ethnic
fucking
cleansing.
super who won't turn on the heat.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
I'm not going to fix anything. And like, eventually you'll just go like, I hate this fucking apartment, even though it's rent controlled. I'm just going to leave. It's like, just to answer you, Paul, like, I think that exists on the Palestinian side as well. Like, I think that's what October 7th is to some extent. It's a, hey, if we make this as painful as we can possibly make it, maybe the Israelis will give up. And look, I think it's delusional on both sides. Like, I don't think that there's a magical combination of things that you can say or do as a Palestinian that is going to make Israelis just go like, you know what, fuck it. And I think the same is true on the other side. I think it's a situation that is tied up in identity. It is tied up in religion. It is tied up in pride. There's that great line in Pulp Fiction where Marcellus Wallace is talking to Bruce Willis, and he tells him, tomorrow when you throw the fight, you're going to feel a sting. That's just pride fucking with you. Like, pride is a motherfucker. There's pride tied up in all of it. Palestinians are digging their heels in because there's pride involved in that. There's pride involved in standing up for your rights, and rightfully so. Like, just to be clear, like, while I may not agree with Israelis, I can understand and mirror that belief on that side. And when I think about it that way, when I think about it as a mirrored feeling on the other side, and try to project how I know Palestinians feel about things onto Israelis, I get to a math that says, okay, nobody's leaving. Okay, nobody's backing down. So given that, how do we move forward? I think for me, what I've had to come to terms with is realizing that so much of it is just acknowledgement and listening. To go back to your original question, Ayelet, like, kind of why I started talking about this, like, in a lot of ways, October 7th broke my ability to ignore the situation on some level, and it broke it in a way where I've got lots of Jewish friends, I've got lots of Palestinian friends, and I was watching what was happening on social media as people were reacting to the attack on October 7th. And like, I'll be honest, like, some of the reaction from the pro-Palestinian side was kind of shitty. I am proud to be Palestinian. I stand for the rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination and independence in their own state. But that doesn't mean that I can look at something like that and go like, yeah, serves you right. I heard a lot of arguments about people saying like, well, Palestinians have the right to resist, which is true. Under international law, Palestinians absolutely do have the right to resist. But that right to resist needs to be focused in order for it to be legal. If we're going to the law and saying they have a right to resist, that needs to be focused on organs of the state. Like, you can attack the IDF, you can attack organs of the occupation, you can engage on that level. It is a stretch to say that the Nova Music Festival is an organ of the state. It is a stretch to say indiscriminately firing rockets into Israel is attacking the state. It's attacking civilians, which is the same argument we as Palestinians make against the Israelis, to say like, look, if you want to go after Hamas, go after Hamas, but don't go after civilians. Like, my problem with the situation and what I saw immediately after October 7th was the desire for people to have conditional or flexible ethics. And to me, like, if you're going to say like international law, then yes, international law. But international law is a cruel mistress, right? Like, it says things like, just because someone commits a war crime against you is not a justification to commit a war crime against them. Even if somebody is hiding in civilian infrastructure, you can't attack them. That is how sacrosanct civilian infrastructure is. And that's got to be true for Israelis when we as Palestinians come out and say, what you are doing in Gaza is a war crime. It's got to be true. But if it's true for Israelis, it's also true for us. It's also true for us that we can't be doing the same thing back to them. And that's where I started to talk out. And for me, I simplify things by trying to be as utterly dispassionate as I can be. And it's not easy. Like, I certainly have the same tribal shit that everybody else grew up with. But I don't know. I guess I'm just looking for a consistency in ethics. I'm looking for a consistency in argument, and I'm looking for a consistency in respect for human rights. Like, if we say that as Palestinians we have a right to self-determination and we have a right to independence and we have a right to freedom and we have a right to safety, why can't we say that for Israelis? Why can't we say that for Jews? And like, put aside all the problems that I do have, very serious and meaningful problems with the state as it exists and as it operates, the Israeli state. At some point, you just have to look at it dispassionately. Otherwise, it'll kill you. Otherwise, it'll tear you up. Because there's no other way through, in my mind.
I see so much mental energy being put into people trying to prove that their side is the righteous one. I certainly see this from my Zionist friends. There's a million different data points you can pick out. And obviously now, October 7th is the biggest one. But there's just so much work put into saying this is why Israel is righteous and the Palestinians are not. And a lot of people who are both Palestinians themselves and people who advocate for Palestinians put a lot of work, and they have a lot of evidence they can marshal to say, no, Palestinians are the righteous ones. And in the end, it doesn't matter, like, at some point you have to say, okay, you prove that you are more righteous and that your victimhood is greater and that your suffering is worse. But what does that get you? Where do you go from there? And if there isn't a next step that's beyond like, we just want to show that we're right, then what have you proven?
Look, I think the lack of movement has actually done this. Because nothing's happening. And when nothing's happening, people move into symbolisms, right? And so you end up with, I read a lot of shit online and I'm fairly involved in social media, and people I follow are people I agree with and people I don't agree with. I go out of my way to follow people I don't agree with. And, you see the like, oh my God, check out this genetic study of like Bronze Age DNA haplotypes. It's like, dude, who gives a fuck? Like literally you are having an argument about a genetic connection to people 3,000, 4,000 years ago and marshaling it as if it is like, oh, this is dispositive, man. We unearthed some clay pots, just outside Ramallah, and they prove that we are the original. And once again, like, to add insult to injury, the area is the connection between Asia, Europe, and Africa. And I said in that piece, like, everyone has fucked their way through the Holy Land. I have cousins who are Circassian. I have cousins who are pale skinned and blue eyed. I have cousins who are extremely dark. It is a mixed up area of the world. It has been for millennia. We had the Crusades. We had, like, you name it. To end up in these, like, kinds of arguments about what happened in the Bronze Age, or whose daddy was here first, and, like, what magical sky person promised it to whom, starts to get into a level of delusion that I think is just, in a lot of ways, a function of the lack of movement.
I mean, you're talking about this idea that seems so, that kind of competitive trauma. And there's this line that it's a really beautiful line that you wrote. I can't even remember where it is. I've read so many of the things that you write, Mo. I end up, like, jotting down in a notebook. But there's a quote, I cannot tell you where it's from, where you write, if we ever hope for peace, we need to start by acknowledging the scale and depth of the hurt on both sides. They may not be mathematically equal, but they are emotionally relevant and valid to the sufferers. That is what I want to feel and believe and act towards. But here's a question for you. How? How can we expect, after what has gone on in Gaza? I mean, I don't know if you guys saw this. I just saw the back of a child who's starving to death, and that image is just stuck in my mind forever. And how can we expect someone who has gone through that, whose family, dozens, hundreds of family members have been killed, how can they reach a personal place of accepting the idea that the scale and depth of the hurt on both sides exists, even though, of course, it is not mathematically equal? How do we help people to do that? Can they? Is it just too much to expect?
I honestly do not know. And it depresses the shit out of me, because I truly believe what Israel has done in Gaza has set things back for decades. And it's specifically for that reason. I used to say that I didn't think that there would be a solution to the Israeli-Palestine conflict until most of the people who had direct experience of the Holocaust and direct experience of the Nakba had passed on, right? Like, that you needed a little bit of that distance for people to be able to, like, look at it with at least some detachment, right? And not to minimize either of those things, but to say, look, it didn't happen to me, it happened to a generation before me. I think that in a lot of ways, both on the Israeli side with October 7th and on the Palestinian side with what has been happening in Gaza, we've kind of reset the clock on that. I think the only way that you get past it, in my mind, is with, as insane as it sounds to say this, with brave and visionary leadership. And I do not see that on either side. I think people, and I say that in the mass sense, like a group of people sometimes have to be given permission to feel things. And I think the great leaders of history do that. I think that's what Mandela did. He allowed Black South Africans to see the world in a certain way that allowed them to move past things. I think the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa is a great model. I just don't see how that happens right now. Like, in a lot of ways, my focus on the conflict is that you focus on people right now, and you focus on getting people to understand each other and hopefully get to a place of more dialogue and more engagement and more demystification. I think there's a lot of ignorance on both sides. I talked to some Israeli friends who were part of Breaking the Silence, and they were saying that, for them, like, they didn't know Arabs. Like Arabs to them were people who were on like construction sites or maybe at a restaurant or something, but they had very little engagement with Arabs growing up until they were, in the IDF and serving in Gaza or the West Bank all of a sudden. And once again, they were serving through a lens of like, everybody you engage with is a potential terrorist. And the same, I think the same is true on the Palestinian side. Like people don't really know Israelis. Like they know Israelis as people at checkpoints or, the soldier that's like making your life fucking hell or making it difficult for you to get to a hospital or get to work or go to the next village or whatever. And so I think it is really, really easy to be an asshole to someone who isn't there.
Yeah.
I can sit here and talk about like, fucking dickhead. If he was here, I'd say blah, blah, blah. But if that guy walks in the room, he'd be like, hey, what's up, dude? How's it going? Like you shut up all of a sudden. It takes effort to be an asshole to a person standing in front of you. Even if you feel like they are an asshole, like human decency and behavior and things kind of kick in and you moderate. I think we need more of that. I think people need to start seeing each other as human beings. I think people need to start understanding. I don't know how we get past the math of suffering, right? Like especially like Gaza it's not close. Like it's not like, oh well, Palestinians have had a little bit more.
Which is why I don't know, it strikes me every time. I mean, and like I said, I felt very keenly what happened on October 7th, and I'll to be perfectly tribal, partly because so many of the people who were killed were of, sort of more of my tribe of Israelis, more of the left-wing Israelis.
You could not have picked a worse set of people for Hamas. It's like, I know, we'll go after Vivian Silver.
Yeah. And also just if you're aiming for who the person that Netanyahu is going to care about the least.
I think you can't focus on the equation. And I think that's at least that's the only way that I can do it. Like I think that I focus on the individual and what the individuals are feeling or dealing with. Look, the hostage thing is fucking terrible. Once again, a war crime. It is a war crime to take hostages, right? But the flip side is it is a war crime to engage in collective punishment. It's also a war crime to like the administrative detentions that have thousands of freaking children. I mean, like let alone the adults, but like literal children who are held in quote unquote administrative detention without charge, without the ability to access lawyers. Like the amount of grievance is massive. Like on the Palestinian side, when I listen to Palestinians talk about the things that they are dealing with, I don't dismiss them. It's not like I say like, hey, dude, that doesn't matter. Get over it. That's not my point. I'm not trying to say that. I'm not trying to say your suffering is meaningless. You should demand to be made whole. You should demand acknowledgement. You should demand apology. All of those things are valid. I'm trying to say that those things need to be put aside from the solution.
Mm-hmm.
That those things cannot be the barriers to the solution. Do you know the Maslow pyramid?
Hierarchy of needs.
Yeah. One of my previous jobs, the CEO who's still a close friend and a mentor would always talk about it. It is a really useful way to think about this. But I think in a lot of ways, like a big part of the problem when it comes to resolving the conflict or the situation, to use the euphemism we've decided on, is that we're trying to solve top of the pyramid problems. We, like the settlements or the right of return or like these things, see that they are very important. They are very critical, but we haven't solved like really basic shit. Like how do you get Palestinians to feel safe next to Israelis? How do you get Israelis to feel safe next to Palestinians? How do you get both sides to acknowledge the essential humanity? This idea that I think pervades Israeli life and pervades Palestinian life to some extent is that the other side doesn't deserve human rights.
Mm-hmm.
There's this idea of like, well, you got to do some shit before you deserve human rights.
Right.
And
do you believe Israel has the right to exist? You have to answer that question. Do you condemn October 7th? You have to answer that question.
Yes, and like I've told you about my man crush for on Zadie Smith, but like she wrote that beautiful piece in the New Yorker where she talks about the shibboleths, right? Like I'm not even going to listen to you unless you go through this collection of words that signify whether I think you're an okay person or not, right? Like as an Arab, it's deeply insulting to be like, well, do you condemn Hamas? Like before we even talk, like that's the opening statement, and you see it over and over again. By the same token, we as Palestinians, we don't see Israelis kind of given the same purity tests, right? Like, hey, I'm not even going to talk to you unless you talk to me about the right of Palestinians to a state, right? Like that's okay to not acknowledge or engage with, because so much of the discourse, at least in the West, is, well, if the Palestinians behave well and do certain things, then maybe they deserve a state. Like it's not an inherent right. It's something that we're put in the position of having to quote unquote earn, whereas like there's no math on the flip side of that. It is considered like a base level law that, yeah, no, absolutely, Jewish people deserve a homeland, but there's no reverse acknowledgement, right? Like there's no acknowledgement that says Palestinians deserve a homeland too.
Well, let me ask a related question. If we put aside the details of whatever the final resolution is, but there is some kind of resolution that gives everybody safety and security and self-determination, what I see from one of the problems from the Israeli side is that I think most Israelis, no matter what the details are, view that as kind of a step down. Like they have their state now. And yes, they have to deal with terrorism sometimes and the moral injury that comes from having an apartheid system on the West Bank. And, if we set this back from before a year ago, and however you want to describe the situation in Gaza with people being sort of semi under Israeli rule and periodically subject to Israeli bombing, and to the average Israeli, like, yeah, these things are kind of unpleasant, but basically, we have a thriving society that's very technologically advanced and has a good standard of living. And and for Jews has a democracy that we can participate in. And any kind of resolution that takes something that away, well, that's a step down for us. On the Palestinian side, on the other hand, almost any resolution would be a step up, right? So I guess one of the things I'm wondering is, from Palestinians' perspective, how does that play into people's thinking, especially as it relates to this kind of abstraction of the fantasy of that we're just going to get everything back and the Jews will all disappear into the ether the same way that
like,
Jews
I
believe
can't speak
Palestinians
for
would disappear into the ether.
Palestinian like thought on the matter. I mean, I can tell you kind of what I've engaged with in pieces and the kinds of conversations that I've been privy to or had directed at me. I think one of the really interesting things that I've seen since October 7th is the collapse, especially among younger Palestinians, of any notion of two-state. Like, I think that's out of the window, right? As far as younger kids are concerned. I think that their perspective is it's one state or nothing. Like, I think they do have a perspective that there's no dealing with the Israelis, that there's no one there to deal with, and which is, like, let's be honest, just a mirroring of I would say a plurality of Israeli society thinks.
So when you say that, Mo, when you say one state or nothing, I can see that I see some of the rhetoric coming out of the universities, and when they say
Sure.
that, they mean one democratic state
Yeah.
for everybody to live in with
And
equality. And when
that's
Jews
what I've heard.
when the Israelis say that, what they mean is our state. Our state.
Correct.
We get it all. So what do you think when you say that the young Palestinians who've been through this brutalizing trauma, 70 years of brutalizing trauma culminating in this past year of unimaginable horror, what does one state or nothing mean, do you think, in that context?
I think in their minds it's idealized, right? Like it's a democratic state where your religion doesn't matter, your ethnicity doesn't matter. Like it's going to be run a certain like as a democratic state, and everybody has rights. And if you want to stay as as a Jew in the context of that state, then great, like you can stay, but you're not staying as someone that has more rights than other people. While I think that one state is a lovely, yeah, that's great. Like who wouldn't want that? I also think it's in the category of magical thinking. Like, to go back to what Paul was saying, right? Like, the idea of two state is already a step down, but like, one state where Israel goes away and is replaced by something else, like, becomes like more than a step down. It becomes like kind of self-abnegation. And I think looking at things, like, my position on one state is that one state only happens with two equal partners. That's the only way you get to one state. And while I'm willing for those people who say one state, one state, one state, from my perspective, to acknowledge, like, great, like, it sounds like a great idea, but I think the only way that you do that is by developing a boring relationship. To me, one state right now seems like, okay, I've got these two friends, they fucking hate each other. Let's lock them in a room together for forever. like, it just, like, it beggars the imagination in terms of, like, I don't think you've thought this through.
Can't rent a studio. They need a 2-bedroom apartment, is what you're saying, right?
I'm saying, like, how about, like, we go out to dinner for a little bit, and then maybe we live next door to each other, and at a certain point, we go, like, you know what, it'd be a lot easier if we just knocked down the fucking wall.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, to me, I don't think one state will ever happen until what I call a boring peace happens. And what that means is, I live in Washington State, and when I drive to Oregon, I don't have to stop anywhere.
Right.
The law is different in Oregon, and the law is different in Washington, but those differences in law are not substantive. And those and the kinds of
And you can move to Oregon if you
correct.
want. And it's interesting. I feel like what you're articulating really neatly and simply is the concept behind a land for all. Have you?
I love those guys. I did a session, a couple of sessions actually, with Mushon Zeravi, who works with them. I think it's actually an elegant solution. What they talk about, I think it moves us towards there. But once again, like, to go back to Maslow's pyramid, we're not going to get there without, like, getting to some really basic shit that starts to say things like, yeah, Palestinians have human rights, whether you like them or not, whether they're nice people or, like, human rights are yours, at the moment you become a human. Right. So for Republicans, that's 9 months before you're born. But for the rest of us, that's on your birthday. Like, you have human rights by existing as a human. The notion that is controversial is fucking crazy. The notion that the Elan Lee phrase of, like, 7 million Arabs, 7 million Jews, none of us is leaving. I would never have imagined that would be a controversial statement. And yet it is.
Yeah.
I've had people go, well, actually, it's like, okay. And this is what I mean. Like, I think that there's a lot of delusion around this whole situation. And, I think a lot of the outside partners accept the delusion. I think the US accepts a lot of the Israeli delusions. And I think, Iran accepts a lot of Palestinian delusions. Like, I feel like the Middle East is already a situation with, particularly the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is already a situation where it's two kids who are overtired and hungry and are just fucking fighting. And it seems to me like outside actors, be it the US or Iran or whomever, engage with it. And they don't tell them to, like, have some apples and go to bed. They give them more shit to fight with.
Mm-hmm.
And when people ask me, like, why I criticize Biden, like, I don't want Biden to be less pro-Israeli. I want Biden to be just as pro-Palestinian at the same time, and to focus on the actual people as opposed to the governments.
I'm grasping for hope. So this is what I'm going to call our hope to close
Sure.
us out today. Jumping on what your Maslow's hierarchy of needs and the necessity of recognizing humanity. So I know this is simple-minded. I know it sounds like something you'd scrawl on a mug. I'm sure Oprah has said it. But I think the best we can do right now is human to human contact. So I'm so grateful to you, Mo.
I appreciate you guys. I really do. I've listened to your podcast. I think what I've seen over the past year is people who are tired. I have never known anything but this conflict. Like you, I mean, we're similar ages. We've never had a reality that did not include this conflict. And at a certain point, you just look at it and go like, why? And I think what has been uplifting for me, certainly a big part of the documentary that we put together was like trying to help show people that there are people out there who are just talking to each other. And the people who are talking to each other are sometimes the people who actually have the biggest reasons to not talk to each other. Like the people from Parents Circle, the people from standing together, like Aziz and Mo's, people like that who have every reason in the world to just look across the divide and go, I fucking hate those guys and I never want to talk to them again, who are actually doing that hard work. And in a world where people like that can do it, I think it is depressing when people don't think they can do it. Like, you get some Arab American kid in Chicago or some Jewish American kid in LA being so bound up in this that they can't see the other side is it's kind of sad when you consider that people who've lost their parents and siblings are able to do it.
So now I didn't know whether I could ask you about, because I know you guys are waiting for distribution. So, which we'll cut out,
Yeah,
don't worry. Like, could we end with you talk, like just a final, very short,
sure.
like plug the movie and
Absolutely. Thank you, first of all, for the opportunity. And if anyone is an Academy voter in the documentary category, please feel free to vote for us. My friend Julie Cohen and I co-directed a film specifically focusing on pairs of people who are doing that hard work. So we found Israelis and Palestinians who, despite everything, despite kind of all the crap in their lives, have managed to kind of get past it and do the work of sitting in each other's pain. It's a deeply powerful thing to do, right? Like to just hear the other person out and not feel like you have to defend it, to just let it be and to let it exist. In all the groups, they've both found ways to do that for each other. And I think what was really gratifying as a function of making the film and highlighting these people is realizing just how many more people actually exist beyond kind of the folks who get highlighted all the time. There really are a lot of really good Israelis, and there really are a lot of really good Palestinians who are moral, thoughtful, caring people and trying to find a way through. And I think despite everything in the world out there and despite what their governments and leaders are doing, they to me are the hope. And I've seen it happen and it's powerful. It changes people when you see it in front of you. And I think that for me and for Julie is very much the hope of the film. That like we're not going to solve the Israel-Palestine situation with this movie, but what we are hoping to do is to just get people to understand that, solution aside, you can still talk to each other. You can still engage with each other.
remind me the name.
Oh, sorry. That's usually helpful. It's called The Path Forward.
The Path Forward. So here's the thing about this film, The Path Forward, Mo, is that you describe yourself as a pessimist. You opened today by talking about how you feel a certain amount of hopelessness. This is a movie of hope. This is a film that exists in a place of hope. Hope is a verb, as we have heard people saying recently. So I highly encourage everybody to go see The Path Forward. I promise you, you'll cry, but I also promise you that at the end, you will feel a sliver of something that makes you want to move forward.
Can I make one quick correction before you end?
Yeah.
I'm not a pessimist. I'm an optimist who takes his umbrella, to quote
There you go.
Harold
Oh,
Wilson.
that's great. All right. Thank you so much, Mo. I really appreciate it.
Oh my God. Thank you guys. I feel super special. I deeply appreciate it. Thank you both for your time.
Bye,
Yeah,
guys.
Thank you so much, Mo. This has been great. Boundary Issues is produced and edited by Paul Waldman. Our music is by Zeke Shabon. If you'd like to get in touch, you can email us at waldmanpodcast@gmail.com. See you next time.